Good evening, everybody. My name is Bri Lee. Thank you so much for deciding to spend your Thursday night here with us for B-List Book Club. We begin, as always, by acknowledging that we are gathering on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Here in the beautiful State Library, that means Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. I encourage you to take a moment and think about wherever you are joining us from and to celebrate the world's oldest living culture. I also just wanted to, it seems like I begin a lot of these live streams with holding space for something major that is happening. And it would be wrong to run a session about information and an election year without mentioning that today Russia invaded Ukraine. And I just want to hold space for anyone who is affected by that and remind everyone watching that Lifeline is always available on 13 11 14. My guest tonight, who I am so excited to be speaking to, is Ed Koper. Ed is a leading communications expert and was on the front lines when the internet collided with democracy, growing Australia's first online political movement, Get Up, to quickly amass more members than every political party combined. He powered Change.org's global expansion into over 18 countries and pioneered techniques to bring politics into the digital age, and has been behind the scenes of many of the last decade's most prominent social movements. He has advised campaigns on every continent except Antarctica. No doubt that will happen at some point in the near future. And actually with all of the new stuff that the Australian government just announced about Antarctica. And high-profile change makers from Malala to Richard Branson. Ed founded the New York-based Center for Impact Communications, which has led efforts to safeguard US elections from disinformation and overcome vaccine hesitancy. Ed also founded a New York City creative agency that serviced multiple Nobel Peace Laureates, political and social leaders to scale their social impact. His groundbreaking campaigns have raised hundreds of millions of dollars for causes, won landmark social change, and have featured in several museum exhibitions. Ed is based here in Sydney now and is the director of the Populares Communications Agency. Thank you so much for joining us, Ed.
Thank you very much for having me, Bri. I'm very excited to be here, part of the esteemed B-List Book Club.
We are going to be talking, of course, about Ed's first book, Facts and Other Lies, Welcome to the Disinformation Age. As a reminder for any of our regulars, and also welcome to anyone who's just joining us, especially to listen to Ed, which I have no doubt there'll be many people, you can ask questions at any time through our conversation. You type them into the Q&A function, and I will leave 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how greedy I'm feeling, and I am then able to direct those questions to Ed at the end of our session. All right. I have so many questions. I've tried to group them into themes. I'm so thrilled that we can talk about this, especially in an election year. I want to start, though, with something a little bit, I guess, broad and for people who aren't familiar with you, because it's a book about who to trust and who to believe and why we mistrust some people and believe the wrong others. I've just read out a phenomenal bio of the work you do. But can you explain to somebody who's not familiar with your, I guess, professional area and not familiar with the sort of behind the green screen of politics, what work you have been doing that led you to write a book like this?
Well, thanks, Bri. I think that's a really fantastic place to start, because the work that I have always been doing involves influencing people's opinions and informing people about important issues.
So you're what an influencer actually looks like.
Well, normally it might be on behalf of people who have influence, who have a high profile, or are well-known activists, or deeply affected by an issue. Whether it's a Rohingya who's fled Burma, or a young climate activist who's going on a school strike. They have a story to tell to the world, and they have really important information to get to the world. And how people receive that information and act on it is critically important, because that determines our government's responses, our social responses, our cultural responses to the really important and changing issues. Now, the way that used to work relied on everyone having a shared baseline of understanding about what was true and what was false.
How long ago did that used to work? When was that?
Well, we're surrounded by many leather-bound volumes
Right, yeah,
here.
this era, okay.
And you know, not everything in these books is true.
Very, very true.
But the fact is, everyone was reading the same one. So regardless if it was true or false, people were getting the same information. Then the internet came along, and the internet was a very liberating and democratizing force in terms of opinion making, because it removed a lot of the gatekeepers and firewalls that we'd put up around information. I mean, you've just written a book about all of this, about that people didn't have equal access for all sorts of inequitable reasons in society. And the internet promised to break down a lot of that. And at the start, it was largely true. For a lot of people, they were able to access each other and information that they hadn't. But there was a problem that there was too much information out there, and the volume of information was so great. And, you know, myself in my work, it was really good when I could email people about things. That's way more cost effective than, you know, publishing a pamphlet or the traditional ways. They're really efficient, and then they can share it with their friends. And we saw the promise of this kind of peak around 2008 when Barack Obama was able to build a grassroots movement with a lot of people doing a little, and that was very powerful. But with the volume of information out there, we had to cede control to someone else to curate that for us and to decide which bit of information they were going to show us, because it became too overwhelming to choose ourselves. And who we delegated that power to was largely social media platforms. And they have all sorts of different incentives, and it's not being a source of your news. That's not what they're set up for. That was an unintended consequence. And as soon as we ceded that control to someone else, and quite often a machine, to decide what we should see, that's where the trouble began. And I noticed it in my work. It became very hard to get information through to people. People were walled off in their own little information bubbles.
So what time are we talking about when you start noticing, if you, in the book you mentioned as well that the Obama 2008 campaign, you think was one of the last sort of the last of the before times?
Look, it bubbled along for a while, and then the world had a watershed moment in 2016. I think these things had been happening before then, but we all got to see it on display in a few really high profile ways. One of them was Brexit in the UK. And then obviously the next thing, which was even more high profile, was Donald Trump's election. And he was really a product of the time, where, you know, maybe it was by design and he's very clever, or maybe the times just suited him. But when someone who came along who paid no heed to truth and really liked to appeal to people's emotive gut instinct, he found a really favorable playing field. And everyone else who was thinking that you can convince people with coherent arguments and cogent policies, they were really at a disadvantage, and they scrambled to discover why. And we still are going through that process of understanding, even in the 6 years since 2016. And that's what I wanted to unpack. That's what I wanted to look at, the root causes of, and then the solutions to how we inhabit this new era and how we can reinvent our understandings of getting information and sharing information.
Fantastic. This is something that I think is good to explain for people who haven't yet read the book at the very beginning. What's the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Yes, so we talk a lot about misinformation, and it really just means any information out there that is faulty or false. And sometimes there's really good reasons for that. Satire is a wonderfully valid and entertaining and important form of misinformation, but it's not malicious. Quite often a journalist will make an honest mistake and then issue a retraction or correction. That's misinformation, but it was unintentional. Disinformation is where someone is deliberately trying to deceive you. They are deliberately putting out false information in order to advance some of their aims. Now, that might be political power. More often than not, it's profit. And sometimes it's just disruptive. But that's the key difference. And that's really what the book talks about, is why are people deliberately manipulating our information out there, and to what end?
But there's such a good section early on where you talk about how disinformation isn't new.
That's right.
Can you talk a bit about how, I guess, what these things, what something like disinformation looked like pre and post internet social media?
Well, let's talk about today's events that you've already alluded to. You know, Russia as a power has always relied on disinformation as a really potent geopolitical tool. And that's not new. In fact, going back even further, lying isn't new, right? Lying is a really important and normal part of our human condition, and there's all sorts of reasons why we lie. That's not new. But during the Cold War, in order for Russia to enact disinformation campaigns, it took an enormous amount of resources. You had to have deep cover agents, publishing materials, gaining access to audiences in foreign countries, and integrating themselves in those societies, and then pushing their viewpoints through there, and trying to manipulate traditional media. These things were really hard and difficult to scale. Now, it's incredibly easy to do this, and Russia still does it. They have been doing it all week as a pretext to invade Ukraine. But now anyone can do it at the scale Russia does. And that's what everyone needs to understand, is how cheaply and easily anyone can use the same techniques that during the Cold War were just the domain of nation states. Now anyone with a barrow to push or an axe to grind can do the same thing very, very cheaply. There's disinformation for hire businesses. For the low price of $8,000, they can get you an article in the Evening Standard in the UK. And that includes Russian to English translation. So, you know, it's important to think about the foreign interference, but that's missing the forest for the trees. Everyone is doing this anywhere. It's happening in Australia, and it's not foreign interference. That happens too, but that's not the destructive thing in Australia. It's the Australians who are trying to pour salt into the wounds that exist in Australia and disrupt people. That's what we've got to be aware of.
There's a few things there that you've touched on that I want to come to later, but before we do, I think one of the real strengths of this book, and one of the things that I loved so much about it and why I'm so heartily endorsed it and trying to spread the word about it, is because of how important it is that it starts with our psychology. Can you talk a bit about, I suppose, just why you felt it was so important to start with that? And in particular, you know, there's this line, our brains are not geared to find the truth, but to find each other.
Yeah, we all have to start at the place of understanding much better how the human brain works. And that's not just for disinformation, that's across society and politics. And we have this self-perception that we're very rational beings. And we also, when we think about disinformation, thinks that it's other people who have some kind of deficiency who fall for it. Right? Neither of these things are true. We all have parts of us that are rational and process information logically, and we all have parts of us that are irrational and driven by emotion and fear and anger. And those parts of our brains are generally dominant. And when we see disinformation campaigns being so successful out there, it's not because there are some people who are susceptible, but because they're playing to the parts of everyone that is susceptible to manipulation this way. So we can't begin to understand how and why it works without first understanding that our brains have always been this way. People have found a very easy way to lean into our cognitive biases.
There's a great section where I felt rightfully personally attacked because you talk about how, like, almost precisely the type of person who would read a book like this is precisely the type of person who has like a certain level of education and a certain way that they've been raised and educated to argue and to think that they essentially wield superior reasoning capabilities, but that those, or I should say ours, are the minds that are hardest to actually keep open. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. And the research that you're alluding to found that people who have well-argued and coherent political positions or moral positions and can explain them very rationally are less likely to change their mind when presented with contrary evidence to their beliefs. So that's very counterintuitive to how we think about disinformation.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is because of something else you mentioned already, where I just hear all the time people pointing to a different group and saying they are stuck in their bubble, their feedback, their echo chamber. But we're all stuck in our own echo chambers.
Yeah.
How do we, what's that? I mean, this is part of a bigger question, which I'm very interested in because of my last book. What's that line of with something like an anti-vaxxer, of just like basically denigrating the wholesale like intelligence of a group of people as a way to sort of discredit them and say that they're in their sort of stupid bubble, whereas we're all in these bubbles.
Yeah, and that's the best place to start if we really are serious about addressing disinformation and some of the problems that the book covers, is to look inward first.
Yeah.
So you and I are no less biased than someone who's reached a different conclusion about the pandemic.
Yeah.
Someone who's looked at the same information or variations of the same story and landed in a very different place. Our own positions are equally coloured as theirs. When I see a piece of information, if I see an image of a polar bear stranded on a tiny iceberg floating in the ocean, I interpret that as being directly related to human-induced climate change, because that's my worldview, and I see it and accept it as a proof point that enhances my existing belief. Now, I don't know the circumstances of how that polar bear came to be there and why it's on the iceberg, but I'm very certain that it's related to climate change, because that's how my brain is geared and my experience has conditioned me. Now, someone else can look at the same image and see something completely different. And this is the problem that our current disinformation age has amplified, is because I can then go and really easily only seek information that reinforces my worldview and only surround myself with people who agree with me and completely close myself off to any contrary information and any counterfactuals to that. And if you agree with me on those points, we can sit here in furious agreement and mock the people outside of our little bubble. Now, that's exactly what they do on their side of the bubble. The people on the streets of Canberra in the last few weeks are convinced passionately and intensely about their reality, and they are coming at the problem with values that you and I would share: concern for health and well-being, concern about the health of our democracy and the corruption of our political processes, worry about the future of the country that's been disrupted by an unprecedented pandemic. They just reach a different conclusion on those issues.
This was actually one of my questions for you. The very last one I had planned is basically like, what do you think when you see those protesters in Canberra?
Well, my gut thinks something very different from what I try to think about them. So I look at them and I think probably what a lot of people think: those people are unhinged. They've lost the plot. They're crazy. They believe things that are patently false. That's what my gut tells me. That's what my cognitive biases make me lean into. And that's a very unhealthy reaction to that. And when I try to do the work to look inward and overcome my own cognitive bias, I see a group of people who have probably all lost friends over the course of the pandemic because of the beliefs they hold, maybe even family members they're estranged from. They might have lost jobs. They might have gone through a very personal story of great disruption and loss. And they've found other people who have had a similar experience and have been cut off from their own peer support network. And is it any wonder that they find each other and have formed really strong bonds that have become hostile to the people that force them out of those bubbles? No, that's an entirely logical and predictable conclusion. So we shouldn't be looking at those people and thinking how far away we are from them. We should be thinking, how do we bring them back to reintegrate into, a fact-based, mainstream, consensus-driven society?
Before we move on, because I want to talk about Murdoch, and then I want to talk about social media. Just on this reaching out of the bubble thing, what's the balance between trying to reach outside of our echo chambers and trying to keep an open mind about why people have come to different conclusions, and then what I feel like sometimes I'm sort of expected to do, which is have rational conversations with people who don't think I'm an equal human being to them? Like, what if the disinformation is, or the conclusions they're reaching about are about sort of human things like race or gender. Like, you know, with the vaccine, it's sort of, you know, what do you believe about this external thing that we can all point to? But what if it's more of like a worldview thing?
So your beliefs and convictions you have for a reason. And, you know, that's what the word belief means. It's something you fundamentally believe. And your beliefs in gender and racial equality are ideas that are in contest with other competing realities that other people have. And if you want the merits of your ideas to win over them, then the way we go about it is all wrong. And the instincts we have of pointing out
maybe let's talk about the don'ts. Because
right.
again, this is a good, sorry, towards the end of Ed's book, he's got a great, there's like, in the version I was reading, there's a table, I'm sure that's still the case, of some of the worst things we do when we're trying to combat disinformation. Yeah.
So, you know, and I agree with you that the hypothetical person you're talking about is wrong. But how do we go about correcting them? We normally go straight to the degree of difference in our opinions and point out the strength of our arguments by highlighting the weakness of theirs, and the weaker their arguments, then the stronger it makes our arguments. Now, that's just not an effective way to have our stories become dominant and have our stories win the battle of ideas, which is so important, right? Like the particular idea you're talking about is critically important for our society, for that idea to win. And if we want to go about it, the things that we normally do, that our instincts do, that we shouldn't do, is to argue in their frame, to negate what they're saying.
So what does that mean for someone?
So if they accuse you of something, our instinct is to say, I am not that thing. If they say something is true, you say that is not true. Now, that's just a very basic tenet of human psychology, that we don't process the negation. We just hear what they're saying, and we're amplifying their own argument. And then when it's wrong, we tend to treat it differently. If it's a lie, we tend to treat it differently than if it's a truth. So when we think about disinformation, our response to it should be the same whether it's true or false, because our brains don't care if it's true or false. But we have a different response if it's false. And if it's false, our response is to fact check it and myth bust it and correct it. If it's online, the platform's response will be to label it or provide a link to some myth busting information around it. None of these things work. These are all our default responses. And study after study has now shown, as people are now getting wonderful research grants into disinformation, and the academic world is building to this enormous body of knowledge, and no one has been able to show any of this stuff working. But that's what we do. So that's a big don't. And then in terms of trying to convince someone, in terms of trying to change your mind, the other couple of big don'ts are, don't do it in public. Because the incentive in public is to be loud and to be right. Whereas the incentive in a one-on-one conversation is to find common ground and approach it very differently. And that's because we are using different parts of our brains. When we're in a public discussion, we are worried about our identity. You know, my brain is working overdrive, saying, oh, all these people are listening to this on Zoom. Whatever I say is going to color their perception of me and my identity. I've got to make sure I say the right thing. I'm using a different part of my brain. If you and I were to have a private conversation, I'm using a completely different part of my brain to that. And that part of the brain is much more effective and open to change, and more effective at changing your mind as well. So that won't happen in public. You and I were talking about before the camera started rolling about, the horrible things people say online. They would never say that to your face.
No.
Right? They would happily send you a direct message about it, or put a comment on something you've posted on social media. They would never say it to your face, because the dynamic is different face to face. So that's the forum where we are going to change people's minds and open them up to our perspective. So we've got to take the conversation from the public into the private. That's one of the key things we can do.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll go to the do's towards the end so that we can all kind of maybe finish on a slightly more optimistic note. I want to talk about media concentration as a part of this problem, because again, one of the things I think is so fantastic about the book that you've written is just how many different angles at which you come to this problem. You could have written a whole book about the Murdoch empire, and people have, and a fantastic fictionalized TV show. But how did you choose what you wanted to put in here about concentration? Because the point I have here is that I didn't even realize it was this bad, but that Australia has the third worst in the world media concentration, only behind China and Egypt.
Yes, two authoritarian states. Well, look, one of the do's, if to skip ahead, is to make sure our stories are engaging and entertaining, and therefore I had to follow my own advice there. And you can only pick part of the story, and it's a really important part of the story to tell. The bigger picture that we're really talking about is the fundamental breakdown of our entire information ecosystem. And we can, that would probably be all of these volumes combined, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a big topic, but we can understand it pretty well through looking at the Murdoch media empire for a number of reasons. The first reason is, as you say, in Australia, it has led to a very concentrated media market. And by that, we mean there is only one company that controls most of the news we get, and then another company that controls the rest of it. And that's just not healthy. I think a lot of Australians really get that because they live under that condition. The other reason that telling the story of the Murdoch empire is really important is that when the internet came along and gobbled up all of the newspapers' revenue in advertising and forced them to scramble into discovering a new news model, which they didn't do a very good job of, right at that same time, Roger Ailes came along to Rupert Murdoch and said, hey, you know how you've built and your father built this decades-long business that really wanted newspapers to appeal to the middle ground because that's where advertisers want, and if you stray too far from that, he said, I just don't think that's the right approach. I think you've got to pick one or the other and pick and be outrageously biased and entertain them. And I'll call it Fox News. What do you think? He said, great idea, let's do it. And it became the most profitable part of Rupert Murdoch's media empire. Now, he's not just a news empire, right? That includes the movie studio that made Titanic. Like, he's got a lot of other bits that make a lot of money.
Yep.
And it was incredibly successful news model. And a lot of people since then have replicated it. They say, if I want to make money selling the news, the last thing I want to do is just tell the news, right?
Yep.
That just doesn't sell. I want to inflame, I want to outrage, I want to lean into these cognitive biases.
Yep.
And that's what gave us Donald Trump, because he built his political campaign on the same kind of impulses that Fox News was built on.
While you've just brought that up, can you explain, it's not here, there's a line in here where you said that people think that sort of Trump boosted Fox News, but your argument was that Fox News created Donald Trump.
Yeah, they did. They proved the concept that in igniting people's political passions is more powerful than appealing to a broader number of people. It's the intensity gap, right? Have a smaller number of people who are more passionate about something is more powerful than having a society-wide consensus on something. And it wasn't just Fox News, right? As the mainstream media in America was reporting this story we're telling now, they didn't realize their own role in it. They gave him hour after hour of airtime saying, look how crazy this candidate is, saying all these unhinged things and lying. Here's a clip of him telling his lies. And
also, aren't his followers idiots?
Yeah.
It's really, yeah.
And there's a thing that I mentioned in the book that's in between a white lie, which is one told for good motives, and a black lie, which is one told to be harmful. They call it a blue lie. And a blue lie is where you tell a lie as a bit of a wink and a nudge to your own tribe to say, look at what a good person I am. I'm fooling another person on our behalf. And that's what Trump built his power and his political base on, was telling lies that the mainstream media thought, well, nobody's going to vote for this guy because we've exposed him lying. But to all of his supporters, they were blue lies, which means they were like, he got one up on the mainstream media. He's our guy. Keep lying, Donald. That's how you know, that's how we know that you're one of us. And it really played to his advantage. And it took 4 years before the US media cottoned onto that and started reporting him a little differently.
What would you say to someone who thinks that that is an American problem?
I would say, read the book.
How should we think about the Fox Newsification of Australia? Or
so it's happening across all the same spheres that it divided America along. One is the media. Sky News is pumping out YouTube video after YouTube video about US political conspiracies. Why is an Australian news broadcaster pumping out YouTube videos about US political conspiracies? Because they get a ton of eyeballs on it, and they are dominating of all the Australian news media. Their online engagement is first and daylight is second. So they've cottoned onto this. Then in the political sphere, others have cottoned onto this as well. The most engaged with politicians in Australia on social media were Craig Kelly before they cut off his, George Christensen, Pauline Hanson, Jared Rennick, Malcolm Roberts. Now, what do these people have in common? They are the ones spreading the most disinformation. They are the ones who learned from Trump's playbook, and it is becoming brutally effective here as it was brutally effective for Trump. We probably don't notice it because I don't follow those people on social media. I'm not in that bubble, but they dominate. If you tally up every Australian politician's engagement every day on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, it's those people who will be rounding out the top few every day in, day out. And that's very concerning because they are able to whip their supporters into a frenzy that has nothing to do with reality and turn them out on the streets in anti-lockdown protests, in anti-vaccine mandate protests. And we saw in the US how this ends, and it's going to end the same way here.
Cool. For those of us who don't want to have to basically follow those politicians in order to be aware and keep up with how bad things are going, what do we need to like keep in our peripheral vision in an election year? Like, what do we need to be looking out for in 2022?
Well, one of the kind of misconceptions around all of this disinformation stuff is because they are extreme opinions, we think of them as happening on the fringes. Now, nobody who holds a fringe opinion and an extreme opinion encountered that in the fringes. They met that in the mainstream. And that's what we've got to keep an eye on. And that's what we've got to be really worried about. You know, what was their first point of contact that led them down into this rabbit hole that took them to a really dark place? That doesn't happen in the fringes. By definition, these things are happening where people get their mainstream information. So one of the things in an election year we need to be really, really attuned to is, are there political elites who are trying to fuel this and trying to appeal to this? And there's some great, a great researcher called Kate Starbird in the US at University of Washington calls this participatory disinformation. And she mapped how it happened in the US Capitol uprising, where there are people feeding up their bits of disinformation to their political leaders, and the political leaders are weaponizing it and feeding it back down. And it's this vicious cycle that ultimately led to real world violence. Now, we have to be carefully monitoring, are people doing it here? We were very lucky here that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, because a lot of the mainstream politicians that were operating out of his playbook had to take a second look at that and worry that maybe it went too far in the US, maybe they should dial it back here. But they might change their mind. And
we might get our own Trump.
We might get our own Trump. And we were also very lucky that Trump wasn't a very good Trump, if that makes sense, right? A better authoritarian would have done a lot more damage than Trump did in America, and would have paid the repercussions would have affected us here and everywhere. So there is a lot of opportunism in this where...
Can you give an example maybe? Like anything that would have appeared in the mainstream, like in a regular news article or in a politician's speech, which hints at the sort of tip of the iceberg that then that would be someone's
there was a
first
leaked
contact.
there was a leaked Australian neo-Nazi manual that said, here's how we grow our membership. Convince them, do something extreme, get the media to report on you, bait them into reporting you, and then pretend to be someone outraged in the comments and start driving the conversation that way. So, you know, I know the names now of a bunch of these neo-Nazi groups, and because I've seen it in the news, you know, I encountered them in the mainstream. And there's some other types of examples you've got to be on the lookout for. And, you know, I don't want to get sued by any stretch of the imagination, so I'll use my lawyerly phrasing here. People who follow QAnon look for breadcrumbs. It's like a scavenger hunt.
Right.
And an opportunistic politician can send them a dog whistle that other people might not hear. So by coincidence or not, when Scott Morrison made his apology to the victims of the institutional sexual abuse, the language that he chose was seen by QAnon followers in Australia as a deliberate breadcrumb he was leaving for them, whether he intended to or not.
Yeah.
Now, there was a 20-page document advising him of the language to use, and it wasn't in there. So we don't know where it came from. But the important thing is the people who heard it interpreted it as enforcing their reality and seeing that as the tick of approval from political leaders that what they're doing is right. Now, obviously, Donald Trump and Scott Morrison can't come out and say it, but he's told us, fellas, you know, we can go for it. You know, we've got to keep going. And that's what they do. So we might not always recognize these coded signals, but we need to be aware that the prizes for the politicians who are trying to capture this really disenfranchised vote at this election, the people who've been out on the streets in Canberra, the people who've been out on the streets in Melbourne and Sydney and elsewhere, there will be a competition for their support. And it could be done in a way that really drives division in community. And as I said before, we saw the end results of that in America. We don't want Australia to be taken down that path. We've got to do a much better job of nipping it in the bud.
I want to move to talking about social media now. And for anyone watching at home, just a reminder that you can type your questions for Ed into the Q&A function at any time. We've already got a couple. You write that to understand what filled the vacuum left by our information ecosystem's disintegration, we need to examine three key converging forces: the platforms where our conversations now take place, the algorithms that determine what we see on them, and the nature of our political conversations that take advantage of them. So I want to get to all three of these things, essentially, which we should have time for. The platforms. How did they get so big? Do you support breaking them up? Maybe it's something here about I liked that you mentioned right back at the beginning of our chat how actually, you know, these things, Facebook, Twitter, were never intended or designed originally to be the place where we got our news.
Yes. So we have to talk about the platforms, the social media platforms in this conversation. What happened was traditionally we gave the media a lot of power over society by saying you are allowed access to our hearts and minds and brains. You are allowed to present us information, and we will willingly, submit power to media so that we can have a healthy, functioning democracy. And the quid pro quo we asked of the media was that you have to set parameters, and we will regulate your ability to do it in the interests of a healthy democracy. And that was a working, healthy relationship for society and for democracy. Now, that's not where we get the same news and information from. We took it and we put that on social media, and we put it behind a private, gated community. The town square lives behind these corporate titans. And we never asked of them the same things we asked of traditional media, which is, if you are going to have so much control over our lives, if you are going to be so influential, if power has to in some way kowtow to you in order to access an audience, there has to be a quid pro quo. and we have to expect that there is a regulated landscape where we have to have things in place like the media did that give a filter for truth and filter out extreme opinions that are harmful, and give a layer of the same kind of journalistic integrity and ethical standards that we came to expect of the traditional places we got our information. We haven't done that. And governments have been slow to realise the transition from one world to the new one. I think all of us have been slow to realise the transition.
It's the frog in boiling water thing.
Exactly. And so first step, we realise we've changed. We've taken the public square and we've put it behind this corporate paywalled community. And then the question becomes, how do you regulate them? What do you do? And the policy responses have been very off the mark so far.
Can you explain, sorry to interrupt, but this is a good point at which to ask. So someone's sitting at home, they're interested in this topic. They remember seeing on the news a while ago that the Australian government tried to make Google and Facebook like pay for news, or like tried to control them somehow. The big tech basically called the bluff and everything went to shit.
They woke up one day and the news page wasn't there.
What happened there? Is that an example of basically failure? Is that an example of trying but it just didn't work?
No, it's another example of Rupert Murdoch rearing his head in our story of disinformation. So look, there's some pretty valid reasons as to why you might want that type of news media bargaining code. I think what it did basically for those following along at home is it said Facebook and Google would have to pay news producers if they want to use their content. Now, that doesn't really understand the way that social media platforms help news outlets. This is the attention economy, and they find audiences on those. And what the news media bargaining code really did was find a way to funnel more revenue to Rupert Murdoch's media empire, because our political class are very captured by News Corp, and they saw a bit of money on the table that might be able to go there. And in case anyone's skeptical about that, since the news media bargaining code has come in, they've struck deals with Nine Entertainment and News Corp, and not a single small local or regional news outlet, which was one of the stated purposes of it. So you can judge for yourself what the ultimate goal was there. So in terms of relevance to our story, it's just an example of misplaced regulation, focusing on the wrong thing. The other thing that policy response has done is really focus on foreign interference, which is important, but that's not the main problem in Australia. That's not going to fix our domestic political manipulation.
I feel like they do that to create an external enemy and just like whip up fear and have something to talk about that's not what we should be talking about.
No, it happens.
But not to the extent that it seems like people like Peter Dutton want to make you think it happens.
No, and it's only ever effective when it's exploiting existing divisions, and those are divisions we create ourselves. Right? Russia didn't make Australians racist against asylum seekers. That was a problem we created ourselves, and our political leaders created. But if they want to spread disinformation, what do? The same bot Twitter accounts that were tweeting about Hillary Clinton in 2016 in America on behalf of Russian agencies were tweeting in Australia that there's links between the detainees on Nauru and ISIS.
Let's talk about bots now, because I didn't realize until I read this book that it's more than just annoying. Like it didn't click to me how much they are a part of the problem. Can you explain why they're the critical role they play in exacerbating the problems that we've been talking about?
Yeah, no, they're a really useful way to look at the broader landscape of disinformation too, because what we're really talking about is that people form their opinions now because of social media chatter. So how do you manipulate an opinion? You control social media chatter. Now, that is very easy to do because you can create at scale with using software, or just sitting there and doing it manually yourself. thousands of fake accounts, and then you get them all to say the same thing at the same time, that becomes a trending topic. It comes to the attention of other people and they pick it up as their genuinely held belief. And then the media reports it as the finger on the pulse of society being outraged about this new topic. And what are the proof points they use? They'll embed a tweet of someone saying something as if it genuinely reflects what society at large thinks. So bots are the cheapest and easiest and most effective way if you want to manipulate a public opinion.
And how does this relate to the algorithm? Let's talk about the algorithms now. How do bots feed into that?
Well, the algorithms are the decisions that the platforms make in terms of what you see. And they are geared to spot virality and popularity, and also to understand you as an individual really well. They know a scary amount about you. One of the most jaw-dropping bits of research that I came across that I put in there is that when these platforms know, I think 20 posts that you've liked, they are better able to predict your personality than your spouse.
Oh my God.
So that's a powerful machine equation that they know.
People should be like getting their, instead of Myers-Briggs tests and horoscopes, they should be getting the bots to tell
like 20 posts and
yeah.
it will be vastly more effective. So the goal of that equation, which we call an algorithm, is to decide what you want to see right there and then. So popularity is a really good shortcut for them to take. That's why things go viral. Oh, everyone's looking at this, then I'm sure Bri will want to look at this too. And so if you can fake popularity, then you can game the algorithm as well. So, the scale you can do at it is scarily easy. And to add to the problem, our brains mistake for popularity for truth. And the platforms have found a way to quantify it.
Because there's a line there where the sort of rational part of you thinks, well, if the vast majority of people like this or believe this, well, then there must be a reason for it. Yeah.
A lot of your followers, I'm sure none of them are listening, when they first came across you, might have found your profile on Instagram and seen the number of followers as the most persuasive deciding factor as to whether they would follow you as well, regardless of what you were saying, regardless of your content or how interested they were in it. That's the best proof point. And social media quantifies popularity. There is a count of likes on something on everything someone says. That plays into our cognitive biases. That's why we need to understand the brain, because we found that platforms are very, very effective at playing into our cognitive biases, and that's why we enjoy being on them. They do us a service often.
With the algorithms, can you explain, I guess, the trajectory down the rabbit hole? And so you mentioned that people first encounter these ideas. Let's take anti-vaxxing as just one example. They encounter it somewhere in the relative mainstream. What does the algorithm have to do with how that person then just gets sucked into that?
Well, being publicly listed private companies, the real incentive for the platform is to drive shareholder value. And the share price is determined by a number of things in the quarterly reporting, like the number of users that might use your platform. But also the amount of time you spend on the platform is another marker of value of your company. The more time you spend on it, the more ability advertisers can find you on it and serve their message. And that's what drives commercial value for a social media platform. So they need to find ways to keep you on the platform. Now, if they did it very rudimentarily, it would just be showing you exactly the same thing because they knew for certain that you like that. But we get bored easily when we see the same thing. So they have to show you adjacent things that are like what you just engaged with, but slightly different. And this is step by step, recommended YouTube video by recommended YouTube video.
YouTube's the one I hear about being
this
the
is
worst.
the New York Times, the really fantastic piece of investigative journalism where a guy who ended up in violent extremist groups and very dark places, was de-radicalized, and he handed over his entire view logs of YouTube for years to these reporters from the New York Times. And they're able to sit there and look one by one how he went from cat videos to neo-Nazi videos. And likewise, Facebook, the majority of people they found in extremist groups in America on Facebook were there because the algorithm had recommended that as a group they might be interested in joining. So we need to understand the power of recommendation from the platforms, and therefore their ability to prevent this from happening, and their ability to use the same forces to show people contrary opinions or to prevent them from being radicalized. That's what we would expect of a public town square. Now we need to ask the same thing of the platforms.
Do you think that's possible? Like, are you optimistic that we can demand more and better from these major corporations?
Well, we give them social license, and social license can be taken away. There is no, look at the reaction that that a lot of people have when Facebook does something like takes away Donald Trump's account or takes away Craig Kelly's account. They decry it as if his Facebook account was a divine right. We have certain freedoms in this country and you have trampled on them. Well, the freedom to have a private commercial account with a company headquartered in Silicon Valley is not actually enshrined in our Constitution. In fact, no rights are enshrined in our Constitution. But by any measure, we have this expectation that this is a public-private utility. And we have public-private utilities. There's plenty of examples in society how we deal with transport, electricity, media often. There is templates for how you can treat something that is not the same as every other commercial interest. And social media platforms are not the same as every other commercial company. They have too much control.
I hear so often, I read, I should say, articles written by people who were sort of at the foundation, time and place of sort of Silicon Valley while some of these companies and products were being built. And people like Jaron Lanier, who then go and write about, 10 reasons to delete all your social media accounts, and the other people behind Facebook who say that they would never, ever let their children use any of these products. Do you use them? Would you let a hypothetical child in your care use them? How do you feel about it these days?
Well, I get a lot of enjoyment and benefit from using social media, and we've got to take the good with the bad. I've lived in different countries, and it's very hard to keep up to date with what your friends are doing and what your family's doing. And I love the fact that people I haven't spoken to for years, I know that they've had kids, and that they're cute. Right, that's a wonderful feature. That wouldn't happen,
especially in COVID.
Huge, people were cut off physically from them, and these online connections are fundamentally important. Facebook is a wonderful platform to build really fruitful communities, and YouTube has democratized people's ability to get information out there, especially at a time when our media landscape is concentrating. So there is good with the bad, and by no means am I advocating a world that exists without social media. What I'm advocating is us realizing that there were consequences of us handing our lives over to social media, and we need to, as a society, not just the platforms, but as a society, we need to understand that there are new skills that we need to inhabit this era. There's new understandings that we need, and starting with school kids, but also with adults. How do we inhabit an ecosystem that favors falseness? Because we grew up in one that favored truth. That's a bigger problem than the platforms, and we've got to be wary of band-aid solutions or just a political opportunity of bashing the platforms over the head. We've got to be much smarter about how we approach it.
I have a question here from Sasha Patterson, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who is 14, listening from London. Oh no, this is a question from Jasper. So that presumably that's Jasper asking the question logged in under someone else's account, which is an excellent
fake
question.
account.
No, this is an excellent question. Thank you, Jasper. Ed, have you yourself ever fallen for a piece of disinformation?
Oh, no, undoubtedly. Thank you, Jasper. I think, as I was saying before, you've got to be aware of your own cognitive biases. I posted a post about the Back to the Future day, that today was the day that Marty McFly set to go to in the future. This is hilarious. And I posted on my Facebook until someone pointed out that's not actually the date in Back to the Future. Someone's just manipulated that image, right? We do it all the time because we're prone to be mostly truthful and mostly believe what we see.
Yeah.
And then as a political communicator, everyone does this. I selectively quote or cherry pick statistics or find sources and share sources that might have done that and tell my worldview really, really compellingly. Like that's a normal instinct, a normal reaction. So everybody does it, and we've got to be aware that we are mini broadcasters when we put things on social media. One of the most impactful studies that has been done on this is that when researchers gave people a simple nudge to think about accuracy before they posted an article, the number of misinformation articles that were posted by that test group halved.
That's huge.
So in other words, we can assume that half of the misinformation out there is shared unintentionally.
Yeah.
So
but then what's the difference between that and how one of the don'ts was to not flag it as disinformation?
Well, you flag it with the platform, don't flag it publicly.
Yeah, right.
So you want to report it to the platform, because their algorithms now, bless their heart, have been geared to not reward things that have been flagged. At least that's what we hope. We don't know. That's what they've told us they're doing. So the platforms could give users a simple nudge to think about accuracy, and some of them have started doing this. If you, I think Twitter does this. If you mention certain keywords about COVID or vaccine, you'll get a prompt before you are able to tweet that and able to post that. And it's another step you have to go through. And it's no doubt from this study that showed that probably is halving the amount of unintentional misinformation that's been shared. Now, it doesn't do anything for the intentional disinformation, and that's brutally effective, and that's what leads to the unintentional misinformation. It was started with someone with a nefarious motive.
All right, I want to finish with some of the do's, because this is what someone's asked about, and I want you to talk about the do's because there's a lot of them in the book and they're fantastic. What are some of the do's on a kind of like interpersonal level? You know, you have a friend who's starting to go down the rabbit hole, or your uncle at Christmas, or whatever it is, on that person to person level. And then what are some of the do's on a more like sort of policy, sort of strategic level?
Well, some of the do's on an individual level are really hard.
Yeah.
And we need to be as committed to the truth as people who tell falsehoods are committed. They're very passionate about it. And that means we sometimes have to do hard things. Often the temptation is, when you see someone who's posting things that seem a bit unhinged or completely detached from your reality, is to defriend them and to cut them off. And that is great for our own information diet, because we're filtering out the noise and don't want to be exposed to it. But one of the unintended consequences is the only people that we leave them surrounded by are the people who agree with them. And we've already talked about how powerful that is, and how it just pushes them deeper into these bubbles and further away from reality. So don't cut them off. The other thing that we've already mentioned too is have a private conversation with them. And we discussed the reasons why that's so effective. Now, the other thing, once you're in that conversation, there are good ways to have conversations, and there are less than productive ways to have conversations. And again, understanding the psychology of this is really helpful, because it allows you to take a step back and not see this person as having these personal traits and characteristics, but understanding that everyone has these same things. And then you find the common ground. Try to see things from their point of view. You don't have to buy the same theories that they're peddling, but think about all of the places that led them there. Did it come from a well-intentioned but misplaced conclusion? Well, agree on the well-intentioned bit. Find the things that you agree on.
When my taxi went past anti-vaxxer protests in Sydney, the woman with the megaphone at the time was talking about her concern for her child.
That's like fairly universal concern.
There are points of connection, I suppose.
And a lot of them are skeptical of the motives of pharmaceutical companies. And
Which is valid.
That's a repitation the pharmaceutical companies have earned through their unethical behavior over the years. That's not irrational. There's no one has a monopoly on these narratives, but the people who are pulling at that person from the other side, from the disinformation side, have found a really effective way to do it. And we haven't found effective ways to pull at them from our side, to keep them tethered to our reality, which is so important. And we can learn a bit from the disinformation people. We don't want to borrow their falsehoods, their lack of truthfulness, but we do want to borrow the passionate intensity with which they spread their stories, and then
the sense of community,
and also the way that they tell their stories. Especially the conspiracy theories are gripping yarns. They are great stories. I mean, they read straight out of Hollywood.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why they're so contagious and so effective, is because our brains want that story.
Yeah.
Our brains take information and process it by turning it into stories. It's why stories are so important. It's why a journalist will tell a bigger issue by finding one person and say how they've been impacted by it. That's how our brains work. But we don't, where is the compelling Hollywood script about our COVID vaccines? There were some heroic efforts that led to that from some unlikely characters who don't look like these stuffy old white men in lab coats that we're conditioned to believe that they are. Why aren't we telling that story so compellingly? Why aren't we dressing it up in the same kind of drama that the anti-vaxxers dress up their narratives in? Because like we said, the brain doesn't care if it's true or false. It's going to favor the best story, and the best story will win. We have to be the better story. That's a bit we can borrow from people who spread disinformation.
Fantastic. Okay, final question. If you could pick one or two things of basically policy, big sort of strategy things, either something that their companies, social media companies, might decide to do themselves, or a new piece of legislation from the government, or something big, what would it be?
I would invest in the ABC and SBS and investigative journalists and local and regional news. I would restore the health of our information ecosystem. That is a vacuum that led to the dark events that the book talks about. The vacuum was filled by something. So let's just plug the vacuum. It's so easy to do. It has such benefits across all of society. It restores the democratic pact that we have between people and institutions, that we are informed citizens who will make decisions and hold politicians accountable when they don't act in our interests. That's been severed. So let's just restore it by investing in public media and in investigative media. The way I put in the book is governments spend hundreds of millions of dollars on our cyber defenses to stop Russians and Chinese agencies from hacking our critical infrastructure. But as I said before, the things that they are doing to interfere with Australia is preying on existing divisions. Right? This is a national security issue. We need to be repairing the health of our information system so that citizens aren't susceptible to disinformation and manipulation. So that is by far and away, my number one Christmas wish list for government response to disinformation.
On the ABC as a start. Great. Well, we've gone slightly over time. That is all we have time for. Everyone watching, I'm sure you're already absolutely convinced. Facts and other lies. Welcome to the disinformation age. Ed, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. And just
Thanks,
before
Bri.
we go, next month's B-List Book Club is on the 31st of March, and the event listing is already up online. You will be able to join us in person. If you are in Sydney or can get to Sydney, you can purchase a ticket, and it will be here with drinks and nibblies and mingling afterwards like the good old times. But we will, of course, also be running the simultaneous free live stream, which again, thank you to Beck and the entire library team for committing to continuing to make it accessible, both financially, geographically, and in terms of ability and disability. So this is the book we're doing next. It's The Mother by Jane Caro. Many of you will be familiar with Jane's long list of nonfiction books. This is a novel, and it's a very dramatic and compelling look at one particular family and a particular woman's way of dealing with her daughter's controlling husband, and it's excellent, and so it's going to be really, really good, and that's on the 31st of March. But for now, thank you once more to Ed. This has been so good, and thank you for the book that you've written.
Thanks, Bri.
Good night.